Mic test 1, 2, 3. Mic test 1, 2, 3. Do you off the music first? Mic test 1, 2, 3. Mic test 1, 2, 3. Hi everyone, thank you for coming down to tonight's event. I'm Singh from SGInnovate, and today we are very happy to partner with Data Council to have Angad Singh from Twitter here to present on understanding social media. At SGInnovate, we believe Singapore has the capabilities and resources to tackle hard problems from around the world, and part of our efforts includes knowledge sharing sessions like the one you're here for today. So without further ado, I'll hand over the mic to Angad, who will start his presentation. Angad, please.
Thank you so much, Singh. So at first I thought the title of the presentation was Understanding Users on Social Media. I don't know, like, I didn't pay much attention to it, but like, Twitter is not social media. Who has thoughts on that? Any thoughts on that? Twitter is not social media? What do you think Twitter is? Come on, raise your hands, anybody? No? Huh? Playground of what? Hang around with people? OK. OK. Interests, right? So it's an interest network, right? Anybody else? Research tool. OK. Yeah, that's a good one. So yeah, I think so the way we look at Twitter, at least from the inside, is that we're not really so much about being social. Like, it's not like, hey, you're connecting with your friend on Twitter. You have so many other places you can do that. There's like a plethora of like names that I won't take. apps on the internet that you can use it. So Twitter is more of like an interest network, right? It's like a micro celebrity network, but not so much from like influencer perspective, but more like, so I'm a data scientist at Twitter, right? To me, a celebrity is a data scientist at a startup, right? Who's doing really cool work. Or to me, a celebrity is like an investor who I'm like looking at, or a celebrity is a really strong principal engineer at some other company, right? So I think those are the kind of people that I really connect with on Twitter, and that's what I think is what Twitter is. Right. So I'm going to be talking about from an insight perspective of how we look at our users on Twitter. So I'll give some before I delve into the slides and before I start talking about data science and like other aspects. I want to give an overview of like what I do at Twitter. What we do at Twitter Singapore. So Twitter Singapore office has been in existence since 2013 or 12 or 13. And so we have been, the office started with like kind of with the idea of like expanding in the Asia region and from a sales perspective, from a marketing perspective, from a Twitter brand perspective. But in 2016, we realized that Twitter's international growth as a product needs stronger engineering and data science and like kind of more strategies and initiatives closer to the markets that we really care about. So in 2016, the data science team at Twitter Singapore was set up. It started out as a very small team. I started as like one of the first person here, along with somebody who moved from the US. And so our objective has been to understand how we can grow Twitter internationally. So it's like we are the only team inside Twitter in Singapore, or like inside the whole of Twitter, that focuses on international growth for the company. So when I say international growth, we do not mean from a revenue perspective. Revenue, of course, is one of our of course, as a for-profit company, it is a target, but it's more from like creating value for users in different parts of the world, right? So I think, and all of that starts from the idea that we should look at users differently in different markets. A Twitter user, and this is true for any company that is in existence right now. We are not the first ones to kind of think about this. Like, of course, Google did this. Google has massive localization in different countries, massive like awareness of what users are looking for as a product. LinkedIn, Facebook, all the other companies have like really nailed this thing. And like I think it's our goal as well to kind of like really understand what users come to Twitter for. And we have noticed this that the needs of users in different countries in different markets are very, very different. I'll give certain examples from the top of my head. And we'll also talk about some examples during this thing as well. So one thing we noticed was that users in the US always scroll from top to bottom in the timeline, while users in Japan scroll in both directions. So I think that kind of like we were confused as to like why is that the case? Like why are users in US so different from users in Japan? Like why are they scrolling in both directions? And I think the answer was very simple, that in Japan, users cared about the recency of the tweets. They wanted the most recent. They wanted to be updated to the most recent. While the US was more of the idea that, hey, like let me scroll through the top tweets, right? So we realized that like, hey, that's a use case that it's very different from Japan and US. So we added we added this most recent button on Twitter, so you can switch from a ranked timeline to a most recent timeline, right? So I think that's the kind of like work that we do at Singapore. So even though we exist in Singapore, we do not necessarily look at like Singapore as a region or like APAC as a region. We look at all globally. So my data science team looks at like we've identified some key markets that we want to focus on, and then from there we kind of like tackle those key markets, understand why users are using. So we work very closely with user research, we work with product managers, we work with engineering teams to kind of understand why users are using Twitter the way they are, and what can we do differently for different users in different markets. But of course that comes with the cost of like forking the product, so we do not want to have a forked product for every market. So it's more around the recommendations that we give. It's more around like kind of how the like smaller tweaks that we can do for users. So maybe certain countries have higher threshold for notifications, right? Maybe they can receive more notifications for relevant content, while certain countries have lesser threshold. Or maybe the onboarding process for a new user when a new user signs up on Twitter is different for different markets, Right. So that's the kind of crux of what we do at Twitter Singapore. And I want to like take you through the journey of like how we look at different markets, how different countries are different. And this is so much about like understanding users on, it's not like from a customer perspective, understand users on social media. It's more from an internal perspective as to like how we understand our users, and especially from an international lens. Yeah, so let's just talk more about me. Wait, okay, yeah. So I'll talk about some like terminology as well in the middle, like what is data engineering, what is data analytics, what is data science, and then understanding some examples of understanding our users. I'll definitely leave some questions for you, like some time for you to ask me questions towards the end. So I'm a manager of the data science team at Twitter Singapore. I've been at Twitter for 4 years as a software engineer, as a data scientist. So main goal is to focus on understanding user behavior to make our product better for all the audiences. And we work on really large data sets and making them easily consumable by our data scientists, by our product managers, and really trying to like make sense out of like what's happening on our product. Since I like asking questions, I have one more question for you. How many tweets do you think are there in a given day? Does anybody want to take a guess? Just ballpark numbers, throw out a number. 10 billion? Oh, that's a lot. Yeah, 10 billion is a lot, but like, sorry? 250 million. So yeah, you're close. So it's roughly around 500 million, like 500 million-ish. Depends on the days as well. So there are some interesting stories with like the number of tweets so I'm just talking about like how large our data is. And tweets is one part of the data, of course. Like there's other data that we have, like around like how users are using the app, like what do they like more, what do they not like more. So if you transform that 500 million tweets a day to roughly per second, so that roughly comes down to 5,000 to 6,000 per second. I'm going to talk about like why international is important, like international meaning like globally, like how different countries behave. So in 2013, there was an event that happened in Japan. There was something that happened in Japan that caused that 5,000 per second number to go to a massive number, and that number has been our highest record of tweets per second, and that was 140,000 tweets per second, which is really massive for a system to handle. And the reason for that was so it's there on the Twitter's blog, so if you want more details, you can read up on that. So there is this movie called Castle in the Sky in Japan, and there's some particular scene in that movie where there's this. I don't know, actually. I don't know much about that movie, and I'm just reading from the blog. So, but I remember being there at Twitter at that time and like looking at like suddenly the graphs go up and like really causing havoc everywhere. Like Twitter didn't go down. Twitter was always up. So there's a scene in the movie where I think the main character says, "I have the power" or something, and then everybody tweets at the same time in Japan. So that led to that massive 140,000 spike. So Twitter is composed of Twitter is one of the companies that has like one of the massive large data sets, both in terms of like tweets as well as kind of like the way we collect analytics events around our app. So like how do we know that like you're scrolling up or down? So like those kind of events. Every company collects particular usage events to kind of better understand their users. Right. So this is like the Wikipedia definition of data science, which I really like. So what is data science? Data science is an interdisciplinary field that uses scientific methods and algorithms to extract insights and knowledge from data in various forms, right? Very wordy definition, but the main idea is that like we look at data, we try and figure out like what's really happening. We start with hypothesis. We start with like what could be happening, and then the goal is to kind of either prove or disprove that hypothesis, right? We could be saying that, hey, users in Japan like a blue-colored like button versus a red-colored like button, right? So I think like that's a hypothesis, and then we can figure out various ways of proving that, and so that's what exactly is like using various scientific methods to kind of prove or disprove a hypothesis. I'll talk more about like these hypotheses and stuff. So I think one of the things that we like when we when we start as data scientists, like when somebody starts as a career in data scientist, as a data scientist, one of the things that always comes is like lots of people asking questions, right? Like, hey, can data answer this question? Can data answer that question? Like one of the approaches that I've taken in this path is that whenever somebody asks me the question, I tell them that, hey, assume that you already know the answer. The answer is usually either going to be a yes or a no, right? Like, hey, do users like the blue button more? Yes. Do users like the blue button more? No. Like, it can either be a yes or a no. So assume that you already have the answer, and then tell me what are you going to do with it. Like, tell me what are you going to do in a yes form, and then tell me what are you going to do on the no side. So once they convince me enough that they can do something about it, that's when I only start answering that question. So I think that's like an approach that I think we should all, like, even if you're not a data scientist, even if you're just like doing any sort of data-driven decision making, that's something that you should keep in mind, which I feel is important. Like, assume that you already have the answer to the question that you're asking, then what are you going to do with it? Like, what are you going to do with both the parts of the answer? And then try and question, like, is it convincing enough for me to like even go down that route? So just to kind of like talk more about data science, I usually break it down into 3 parts: data analytics and visualization, machine learning, artificial intelligence, experimentation, and statistical validation. I usually find that, like, whenever I talk about this slide, I usually find that people know about the first 2, but usually do not pay attention to the third one. So experimentation is actually, I'll talk about it, is one of the, like a very important field of like data science. It is the real statistical application of like how we learn from doing stuff versus just looking at the data, right? It's a way of generating new data, right? So let's talk about just the data engineering part. So data science and data engineering go very, very hand in hand. In fact, so my team, when I'm building out my team, like this is what I tell everyone, that a data scientist is a 70-30 data scientist, data engineer. So there's like he's a 30% data engineer, while a data engineer is like a 30% data scientist, right? So there's massive overlaps in their roles. And this is also, I think, some definition that either I made up or somebody made up. I think I made up. Yeah, so it's basically figuring out like how do you process these large amounts of data, and then come to a way in which you can use the data to make conclusions, right? Come to like produce clean data from multiple sources to like come to a conclusion. Data engineering is usually a very core computer science field, and it's like a very, very important part of like data science, and yeah. I mean, just some examples of like what are the tools that data engineers use. ETL, extract, transform, load. That's a very common definition of like you extract the data, you transform the data, you load the data to do analysis. Batch processing using various like common tools that MapReduce, Hadoop, Spark, Scalding. This is some things that we use at Twitter. Then once you have the data in a certain clean format, then you load the data in Python or R use SQL. And then you do visualizations using R, Tableau, or like any of those popular tools. Sure, yeah, okay. Data wrangling, meaning like it's like slicing and dicing. So you have some data set. I mean, it's just a different term for slicing and dicing. Like you basically explored the data with like all the dimensions that you can think of, and yeah, like convert the data from like one format to another format, or do like simple aggregations on the data, like, hey, count the number of unique users that did this, right? So it's just like that term doesn't have a very special meaning. Cool. I just have this slide. I don't know why, but like this is it's a data engineering pipeline. What it looks at Twitter. There's nothing special. I mean, a lot of companies have this very similar pipeline. If you're very curious, there's a link at the bottom. I can send this link somehow. So basically, this is like how we collect data, right? Like you have mobile devices. We see that you like a tweet or you click on something. So we have these things called the interaction events. Then those are ingested into like various services. Then this is the kind of main guy, Hadoop. This is where we like kind of do all our data processing. All the ETL jobs kind of run over here. And then I'll talk about this part. Like this is basically our experimentation framework. Like how do we experiment with various new features, and then like push out those features to the devices again, right? Yeah. I like just this slide because it has a lot of arrows. There's nothing, right? So then comes the final part, like, which is the data analytics and validation. This is the part that we kind of like really like spend a lot of time on. Like, I mean, we, of course, data engineering is like very, very important, but like I think that's a, like at a given scale, data engineering has its own challenges. But like towards the end, once we have the clean data, this is the part that kind of makes us like take decisions on that data. So data analytics, it basically just means that you explore data based on some hypothesis, visualize it using various tools to kind of communicate what the end goal is. I'll show you some examples of that. So this is one of those analyses which actually has no results. I mean, which basically you cannot really make a product decision based on this thing, but this is just for a fun analysis. Not something I would have done if somebody came to me and asked it, but like if I had a lot of free time, I would have done this. And so if you look at like how Twitter users tweet good morning at different times in different cities around the world, right? Like we can learn something about users in different cities, right? Like, or some cultural differences in like different cities. So we have billions of public tweets to detect events and visualize how they're synchronous or asynchronous in their nature, like how certain events are tied together with other events, right, at a large scale. So this is something interesting. So this tells you the cultural difference between London and Madrid, Spain. I don't know if this is true, but I guess this is true. So which city do you think parties harder? London? Why? No, what do you think? I don't know. Like based on this data, this is so blue line is weekday, orange line is weekend, and this basically shows the time during which they tweet good morning. Yeah, so because like they're staying up late on weekends, so they're tweeting good morning much later in the day, right? 9 a.m. Oh, okay. Oh, maybe the other way around. Okay. So I think I think it's Madrid, because usually culturally they start their day early on a weekday, but on a weekend they start the day much later. I mean, of course, I mean we. Right. And that's why I said this analysis doesn't really give me an answer. But so I mean, yeah, we could argue like what is the difference. But like I think this is some of an example of like a simple analysis that we could run on our data. Yeah, and time zones and everything. Yes, so that was corrected. So yeah, so I mean, this is something like a very simple one. Like, hey, the peak for Madrid is like early morning, and the peak for London is like 8 a.m. Right. This is another interesting one. So this is, I don't know if the graph is very clear here. I should have gotten a higher resolution picture of this thing. But this is, so on the y-axis is 0 to 24 hours of the given day. So it's the 24 hours. And then this is like kind of think of these lines. Each line represents a day in the year. So this is the years, like the whole year. So I don't know if this is very clear, but like, so at night, like the density of tweets, so this is the number of tweets in a given time. At night, of course, like we don't expect a lot of tweets. But then one thing that we notice is that during the daylight savings time, there is this, during this daylight savings time, during the summer months, that there is the shift in the graph. So there is more tweets that are up to a later time. So like people are sleeping until late and like waking up, sleeping late and waking up late, right? So there's this like kind of time shift. If you go to the blog on Twitter, you'll see a much clearer picture of this thing, but yeah. And then if we do this same for Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, the graph is even more interesting. So you can clearly see there are certain lines here. Like, I don't know if this is very clear. I don't know if I can see this. So there's a line that's following like a curved line somewhere in the center. So that line and the bottom line is the prayer times. So it's the sunset and sunrise prayer time. So there's like a time where the activity, the tweet activity reduces. And then you can see a patch here, which is very white, like which is very, very little. So this is during the Ramadan months. So like the tweeting activity like reduces during that time. So there, I mean, this is just like kind of understanding how different like countries and cities behave on Twitter. There is, I mean, this data is useful. This is an example of like interesting, but not sure if it's very useful, but like very, very interesting to look at, right? This is something what, yeah. But I mean, based on this, if I were to ask me, like if I were to make a product decision, very hard to say, like what product changes we would make based on this. But I'll, go ahead.
Sorry, one question from earlier, what you mentioned about Japan and US clicking up and down, etc. So I understand when somebody favorites something or retweets, likes, etc. You can capture this. But how is someone flipping the screen up or down? How can you actually capture that?
So I mean, so the question is, how do we capture like scrolling action, right? I mean, so that's a common like a device feature, like you can like, or like I don't know, like it's part of the Android app, or where you can see like, hey, like which direction is the user scrolling? Like we know, like we are rendering tweets either from the top to bottom or bottom to top. So based on that, we know that which direction you're scrolling, right? Sorry, say that again. It's a mobile, yeah, thing, right? So this is another. I'll talk about like towards the end. I'll talk about an example of an analysis where we actually made a product decision. But let's talk a little bit about like this field of data science as well. So this is what we call more on the online side of making decisions, right? So making a decision to show you a certain tweet, or making a decision to show you a certain account that you should follow. So that's on the real-time path, where basically you log into Twitter, you open Twitter, and then you see recommendations for yourself, right? Or like it's very similar across all major companies, like Netflix. You open Netflix, you'll see movie recommendations, right? So this is very similar to that. So this is the idea is that like based on your kind of interests or the accounts that you follow. So we'll recommend you similar accounts, or we'll recommend you similar content that you'll probably like seeing on Twitter, right? And so this is where the other field of data science is, where we learn from your existing data and make predictions on data. The simplest example for this thing is the one that I talked about. It is the who to follow recommendations on Twitter, learning from our users based on what content that they engage with. We can recommend similar. So for example, I don't know, this is random accounts that I picked up very recently. Like I like to follow technology folks and like data scientists. And this is like this Hang Kong Bongo bot is like some of my friends' bot that he created. Yeah, so like these are recommendations that I get when I look at who to follow on my account, right? And these are all based off my interests, which are mostly around tech, mostly around like technical leaders. Yeah. Right. So this is the next and the most exciting one for me, which is experimentation. So historically, like, I mean, mostly what people associate data science with is like you look at past data, or you look at what users are doing on the platform and then make decisions based on that. That is one way of knowing stuff, or that is one way of validating the hypothesis. But most of the time, you end up there with a correlation and not a causation, right? So you know that, hey, if a user spends 10 minutes on the app, there's a high chance that this user will log in 30 days later again, right? I mean, I don't know, this is a hypothesis that I'm putting up. But that's a high chance. That's like still a correlation. But the whole idea of experimentation is that you want to prove your certain points. You want to prove with statistical significance that whatever experiment or whatever hypothesis that you have, does it really compare across? Does it really compare across the treatment and the control groups that you have? So this is another very exciting field of data science. It's basically procedure carried out to support, refute, or validate a hypothesis. Right. So we launch all features. So anything that happens on Twitter, any feature, any UI change, or any even recommendation engine change, all of these features are launched as experiments to ensure that like all our changes that we're making are supporting or refuting our hypothesis. This requires analyzing the results of the experiment and ensuring that the results are valid as well as significant, right? So we want to make sure that enough users are taking part in the experiment. This is very similar to how experiments have been conducted across various fields of sciences, physics, chemistry, biology. So in fact, a lot of data scientists at Twitter come from like these backgrounds, come from like really strong statistical backgrounds and help us do these experiments. There are lots of edge cases in this thing. Like for example, if we make a change to a certain user, but then that change is seen by another user, like how will that influence the other user who's not part of the experiment, right? So we call these the network effects. There are lots of ways to solve these edge cases. There are lots of very interesting edge, like nuances like these. So I'm going to talk about like, so this is what the process looks at Twitter. So you build a hypothesis, you define what will be a success metric. Will it be the success metric be users clicking more of that button, or I don't know, spending more time on the app? Then you test the hypothesis, you learn from it, then you ship. So you keep on iterating based on this. What change about Twitter do you know the most? Like, which is the most visible change that Twitter has ever done that anybody might remember? Does anybody remember? Sorry? Right. So Twitter moved from 140 characters to 280 characters, right? So that was one of the biggest most visible changes that Twitter did, right? And that was one of the most exciting ones internally as well. Like, I mean, it presented a lot of statistical problems. All the data scientists went mad crazy. They were like, wow, this is the love of my life. We need to solve this problem. So I'm going to talk about that, and basically 280 characters. Like, why did we do it? You can also go read the blog post on it. It basically talks about the same thing. So this actually came from an international need. And like kind of analyzing different languages and how people are using Twitter in different languages. This graph kind of like explains it. I'll just briefly take you through this graph. This is the number of tweets that are there for the number of character counts. So historically, we had 140 characters, right? And we basically tried to see what is the average length of, or what is the length of tweets for length of tweets and the number of tweets, right? So one thing that we noticed that most tweets in Japanese, like the median, lied at 15, while in English it lied at 34. But then the interesting part was that only 0.4% of all the tweets in Japanese hit the 140 character limit. So only 0.4% of those tweets had that annoying part, like they wanted to express more, but they were not able to express more. I mean, we know the reason why. Japanese is a very dense language. A lot of things can be said in like very small number of characters. But it's not the same across other languages as well. So all the Latin character-based languages, or even other languages, like this is not the case. So we noticed that 9% of all the tweets in English hit the 140 character limit. So this is a very significant number, right? Like, I mean, are we annoying those 10% of those users? Or do people actually have to say a lot more on Twitter? So we ran this as an experiment. This was one of the more difficult experiments because we had the issue of the network effect, right? Because if you saw a tweet that is 280 characters, but you're not in the experiment group, then you're basically getting biased by that. But yeah, so I mean, this was solved by like launching it to like limited circles, like networks where we knew where the dilution would be lesser. Yeah, this was one of the most like data-driven and most visible change that Twitter led, based on like kind of understanding how tweets in Japanese or how things in how tweets in English are hitting the limit, and people have to express more. Right. So I'm getting to the close of my slides. But similarly, so we have also been observing very different, like lots of differences across countries. Has anybody heard of the feature bookmarks on Twitter? So that actually also came from a need in certain countries where the like button was considered a very strong symbol. So you know the like button on Twitter, it's a heart, right? For us, like a heart, like liking heart, like hearting us something, like we do it all the time on like other platforms as well. it's a very common thing. But in certain countries, that red heart symbol is a very, very strong symbol. So the user research team came back to us and said that, like, hey, we've talked to users, and it seems like they are, like, that's a concern. Like, people are not liking tweets because they're not, like, loving everything. Hey, I love the tweet. It is not supposed to be such a strong symbol. And we also had this feedback that people want to save tweets privately. People want to save tweets for reference later. And this increased even more because we started noticing an uptick in tweet storms. I don't know if you've heard of tweet storms, but tweet storms are like a series of tweets that, like, it was pioneered by one of the investors, Andreessen Horowitz. So our team worked on this. The Singapore team worked on this analysis where we looked at, like, how users are wanting to privately save tweets. So they were basically messaging themselves the tweet back. They were just DMing themselves the same tweet back and, like, storing it as a private collection. And we noticed that thing in specific markets. So we decided to experiment with this feature called the bookmarks feature. So it's like a private collection. So you can add a tweet to bookmark. And surprisingly, a lot of countries adopted it. A lot of countries, and in fact, it was not a US, like, that feature is one of the features that's not so much used in the US, but, like, in a lot of other countries. So I mean, there are more examples like these, like, where basically how users in different countries are different and how we are trying to adopt our product for these markets. So in summary, like, we talked about all of these things. I'm happy to, like, take questions about these things, and you can follow me on Twitter. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Go ahead.
So two analysis which I think would be very interesting for everybody to know is fake news
Great.
and bullying. These are the two main topics which I think people kind of want to know how you would analyze that and how you would help suppress that.
So Twitter spent a significant amount of energy in the past couple of years on solving that problem of fake news, as well as trolling and violations of our terms of service, which could be like threats or like misinformation or like any other policy violations. And the way we have done that is both through machine learning as well as like kind of enforcement, like kind of through people reporting tweets, and then like having human agents as well as like machine learning bots look at those tweets and take a decision as to like should we hide those tweets or should we downrank those tweets which are clear violation of a policy. Like so we are taking very, very active steps towards that. Like Twitter is like in fact a very significant portion of our engineering resources are dedicated towards combating spam, bots, fake news. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. The question. No. So as of now, no. There's no reason to have an edit button. It's just a group of vocal users who want it. It's not a very. So the question is about edit button on Twitter. Yeah. So I mean, we've definitely received a lot of questions on that. But the answer is that, like right now, it does not. It's not a thing that we are addressing right now. Yeah.
Yeah, many people say that data is new gold. I think it's a really important question for Twitter, how to monetize the data you have. I wonder if you can share one user case or any commercial cases that you linked with data to commercial marketing strategy or something.
So I think like our team is like one of the like us focusing on international growth is an example of that, right? Like so we are looking at markets that are completely untapped for Twitter or wherever we've only seen organic growth and we have not really done anything special for our users, right? So there have been early adopters in a lot of markets, but we want to expand to the mass market to kind of figure out what our goals are, like why should we be addressing those needs of those users. So I think, that is like the whole strategy for Twitter to grow from both a user perspective as well as a revenue perspective. So yes, that's the gold part of Twitter. Yeah. Are you looking for any other specific area, like in terms of this definition?
No, so basically you use data and data engineering to enhance user experience in general for Twitter users, not the external partners or collaborators.
I mean, Twitter does have a data program, so where basically you can tap into the Twitter's fire hose, which is basically all the stream of tweets, right? And there are lots of people who use those stream of tweets to make real-time decisions on like trading and like other strategical decisions. So that's a common use case. And anyway, Twitter is mostly a public network. So yeah, I mean, like if people are able to make decisions based on that, like that's a positive thing. Yeah. Go ahead.
I'd like to ask a little bit more about the experiments. So how do you conduct the experiments? Do you, when you have a hypothesis, do you select a small group of users, and how do you select them, like on what basis? And do you get them to test, something iteratively, and how does it happen? And do you ask them, is it just observations of how they, your observations of what they do with the change, or do you actually gather feedback like a focus group, that kind of thing, like qualitative feedback?
Right. So that's a good question. So most of the experiments that we run are automatic experiments. So if you're a Twitter user, you're definitely part of some experiment, right? You're definitely part of some like back-end experiment, like where we have changed the ranking a little bit, or where we have we're trying out a new model for like recommending you accounts, or we are trying out a new UI component, like maybe the button is moved slightly towards the other side, or we've added a new button. So that's very, very...
So the interface that each user sees could be a different interface?
Yes, very, very different. It could be, not very different, but it could be different, right? Most of the experimentation is automatic. So we work with the engineering team and the product teams to kind of define what the treatment and the control groups would look like. This is traditional experimentation where you define a treatment group and you define a control group. We ensure that we have enough, so for any change that we're trying to measure, we ensure that we have enough power in the experiment, meaning that we have enough number of users to be able to say that hey, because these many users experience this change, that's why this is a good decision to ship this product, right? So, and we use statistical methods to kind of measure those differences across the treatment and the control group. So I would say almost all experiments, actually all experiments are automatic, meaning that and all the users are randomly bucketed. So there is no, we sometimes might do country-specific experiments, where we might limit that experiment to a particular country or a particular set of countries. But most experiments are completely random. We select 1% users. We can also define hey, if a user is in this experiment, then he should not be in this conflicting experiment. So we also define constraints like that. So most companies have either they use third-party tools like Optimizely or other tools, but Twitter has its own internal experimentation stack with which we are able to define these constraints and say that hey, this user should be part of this experiment group, this user should be part of that.
And the experiments don't involve collecting actual feedback about experiment, because they don't know they are part of the experiment, right?
Right. So that's the whole way. It's a blind test. It's basically it's always users should not know that they're part of the experiment. I mean sometimes they know, right? First they see the UI differences, but the whole idea is that the user should be treated as part of these various experiments, right? We do user research as well. So that's more of the focused learnings where you basically sit with the users. I mean, it's not the data science team, it's the user research team that does that, and then they collect feedback, real written verbal feedback about a certain product or how they're using it. That has its own value. That has its own merits, and we learn a lot from them. That's where we generate a lot of hypothesis. But coming back to kind of the experimentation side, that's where we kind of know whether something really causally works or if it's just pure correlation. Go ahead. So it depends on the experiment. It depends on what the experiment. So the question is, what metrics do we use to kind of determine if the experiment is valid or just significant.
Yeah, to conclude
To
whether
conclude.
the experiment was successful or not.
Right. So I mean, the experiment being successful is determined by what target metric we have defined. So for most experiments, the target metric can be either the usage going up, or either like kind of the button clicks going up. So I think that's the end goal. So it depends on experiment to experiment. So for example, if we say that the experiment is like the button should be blue in color or the button should be red in color, then either one of them should go up, right? Like the clicks on either one of the buttons should go up, right? Go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
Hi, sorry, would you mind repeating?
So, wow, it's loud. API, can you just describe what the recent changes have you made to API? And is it still gonna be, for example, the streaming, as I understood, is limited, so now you need to subscribe to pay to get access.
I am actually not very aware of that
Okay.
because I do not work with this developer relations team. So this is more of
Okay.
the developer relations questions.
Sure, okay.
But yeah, I mean, I could connect you to somebody who could answer that question.
Okay,
right.
thank you.
So all these changes are for user growth.
Yeah, so I assume that all these changes are for user growth.
Right.
And have you all seen concrete data to see when you release a new feature, a new product, like you say, you actually see user growth, and what is the typical lag time before you see the impact?
So so I think it's very, very experiment dependent. So I think one that I can talk about is which is specific to international. So improving the performance of the app has almost an immediate correlation with, or immediate response to user growth. More recently, we have been working, so our team is also heavily invested in improving the performance of the app, and also actually finding what's the relation between latency of like opening the app, getting the tweets, and then in user growth. And this is specifically important for like emerging markets where the internet penetration, I mean, Singapore, we do not feel that. Like in Singapore, you open Twitter app, it's very fast. We are one of the best, one of the well-connected countries. But like in remote parts of certain countries, and for Twitter, it is actually even an important problem, because there could be somebody who's stuck in a very poor connectivity zone and really needs that connection. And we've had like lots of cases where people have actually, like lots of like really heartwarming stories where people have actually used Twitter for like, for getting themselves out of like lots of sticky situations. So performance is something that like where we have seen growth. I mean, even like reducing the latency by a couple of milliseconds, like less than 100 milliseconds, even reducing by like 50 milliseconds or 100 milliseconds has led to 5-digit, 6-digit growth in user numbers, 5 to 6-digit user growth numbers. So that's something that, and we're actively working on that. So so there's this product that we have which is called Twitter Lite. I'm not sure if it's available in Singapore or not, if you can download it on the Play Store or not, but it is available in almost all countries where we know that performance is a challenge. And Twitter Lite like really makes Twitter really fast, and we've noticed that because of that, like we've gained user growth.
In all experiments involving human subjects, there's always some ethic guidance around in all fields that we know of, established fields. So what are the guiding principles of ethical guiding principles in Twitter regarding experiments, since you have spoken about experiments?
So I think, I mean, one of the things that we really care about is kind of making sure that there's no like kind of biases in our experimentation. So the way we select the users, it's completely random. So there's complete randomization. I mean, it might be country specific for a particular UI change, but even amongst that, like there's complete randomization. So I think that's one of the things that ensures that whenever we are running any experiment, we're not introducing any bias, we're not creating any biases towards, and we do not run experiment on content types, right? So like most of, like all these experiments that I've talked about, these are more around UI changes or like kind of recommendation engine changes or like, but they're not around like, we'll not say that like, hey, sports is more popular, so like let's like boost sports, right? So at least not till now we have not, like we've definitely not like done that, but like I think eventually we do want to look at that and see like how we can, but like of course like keeping ethics in mind, keeping yeah, and in fact like there is a group internally at Twitter and there's more recently, like I would say in the past 2 years, and Twitter has been spearheading this thing. There's this thing called fairness in ML. It's called fairness in machine learning. So which ensures that how do you make models that are not biasing any groups or not biasing towards any gender, or yeah. So that's something that we really care about. Yeah.
What about issues like do no harm? What mechanisms do you have to monitor that the experiments are not harmful subjects? Like for example, copycat suicide trends and all that.
What kind of trends are you talking about?
For example, as an example, but not limited to copycat suicides.
Okay. So I think that's all, like when you talk about like self-harm and talk about like even more graver things on the internet, I think so that's usually taken care of by the health team at Twitter. Like, so we have like a health team which takes care of like looking at abuse on the platform and looking at like how spam develops or how like kind of consorted groups develop on the platform. I mean, I do not have a very specific answer to you, like if there's a guideline for that. And our team has not looked at, like, our team cares about like kind of the health, making sure that like whatever we're doing, so we have a metric which defines like if an experiment is increasing the number of reports or increasing the number of like kind of unhealthiness. But like I think we do not, like it's the health team that will be able to better answer this question. So I don't have a very, very clear answer to your question.
Hi, thanks for the talk. My question is pretty much related to the previous one, but I wanted to ask about the business side and those businesses actually participate in Twitter platform as advertisers. So in this talk, you were talking about how you improve experience of the users by doing experiments and enriching their user experience in the end, right? But how about targeting the ads to the users? To which aspect you can actually incorporate this behavioral data to target users on Twitter for the advertisers? Where is the border? Which data can be used for that and which cannot be? And general pipeline, how does this handled in Twitter and ensures that I assume that data records are all anonymous and so on.
So do you want anything else to add?
Thanks.
So I think this is a very, very specific question towards ads and like how do we show ads on Twitter? Unfortunately, I'm not very, very aware of like the ads sides of these things on Twitter. So I don't think I'll do a very justification to that question. I'm happy to like have you connected to somebody at Twitter to kind of answer that question in detail.
Yeah, hi. In terms of the user segmentation, you spoke about one aspect like geographic earlier. Are there any other types of segmentations that you use, like demographics, psychographic, or behavioral? And any particular use cases that you can highlight where you could have used other types of segmentation? So
there is, so we look at geography as one of the major segmentations, and this is based off like the imprecise location data that we have on the users. And then I think the other segments that we use, we do build models internally to kind of like predict a user's age, to kind of like figure out like, and that's I think that's available in the ads targeting as well. So like kind of like if somebody wants to advertise on Twitter, you can target like certain age groups. So we do look at that, but that's not been our focus so far. We look at what kind of, like we could be looking at what kind of device you're using. Are you using an Android or iPhone? So that's something that we commonly look at. So I think one of the most common things we do is like Android and iPhone, like segmentation. We do notice users using the apps differently. The others that we look at is like how often you log into Twitter, right? Like how often do you, like in a month, like are you opening the app 7 times, 10 times? What do you mean by customer personas?
A typical customer persona could be a combination of these various traits, My user could be, so-and-so age group. He could be living in so-and-so country. He could have these XYZ tastes and preferences, etc.
So we currently do not. No, we do not like go deeper down into those use cases. So I think it's still pretty broad when we look at I think our main focus as a team is purely look at like how like certain countries are different from each other. So I think that's one of our main focuses. Yeah. I think do we I don't know do we have time for more? I don't know. Okay, maybe like two more. Sentiment analysis is a very popular PhD project that a lot of people do. I think. So no, I think we haven't. So internally, we do not. We have not had the kind of like use cases yet for like looking at content. I think we're trying to stay very content agnostic in terms of like I think it's still more around like how users are using the product, how users are navigating inside the app, or like what correlates to like, hey, if you like somebody's tweet, there's a high chance that you like their tweet again, right? So like things like that. Yeah.
So does Twitter has a function to avoiding experiment confliction? I mean, let's say like team in US testing changing a color of a button, and the team in Singapore change another UI component. In that case, maybe result could be biased. So is there any way to avoiding this kind of confliction between multiple experiment?
So we definitely have the capabilities of like excluding like if a user is in a certain treatment group, then we don't want that user to be in another treatment group. So we do manage that. For example, if somebody's in the UI treatment group for this thing, then then they should not be in the other experiment.
Okay, so your software has this kind of functionality.
Yeah. Okay. So the experimentation tool has this kind of functionality.
Yeah.
So I guess if that's all the questions, I believe. If there's no other. Thanks for listening in. Let me know if you have any other. You can tweet to me other questions. Yeah. Thank you.